Gerry, I'm turning this over to you. Gerry has been part of this congregation now for, almost a year, a little more than a year, has spoken three times, and it's always a delight to have him, always thought-provoking, and such an interesting background. Gerry.
So, good morning, and thank you, Wava. And I'm delighted to be back to offer some thoughts on a pretty important topic in today's age, loneliness in an age of connectivity. And this is a topic I've given a lot of thought and consideration to over the past few years, both personally and in terms of the wider community and the world and the age that we live in. So I'm all organized today. Actually, I have a few pages I'm going to refer to and kind of a roadmap, which is not always the case. So there'll be four elements or components to what I share with you this morning. First is loneliness and youth. Second one, loneliness and being alone. Third one, the spiritual dimension of loneliness. And number 4, a checklist. So, when was it? In 2015, I was working on the first draft of my book. And the way I would do that, the way I like to do that was I would wander around different places for inspiration. So I'd have my Google Chromebook, and I could be in the library, I could be in a coffee shop, I could be outdoors, I could be at home. So I did that very deliberately, just to be inspired by the environment, the energy, the life that was going on around me in that particular place, and filter that into my writing. And for the most part, that did work. So on this particular day in 2015, I was in Abingdon Library, and I'm thinking, well, where do I camp out today? What corner of the library have I not commandeered to do my writing? So I was wandering by the teenager reading area. They have their own little kind of sub-library in the main library, and there was no one there. So I thought, okay, I'll camp out in the teenager section of the library and see how that goes. Now, in retrospect, I was just thinking the other day that probably wasn't a good idea. You know, in this age of Amber Alerts and political correctness and hypersensitivity, probably not, a middle-aged man camped out on the floor with a Google Chromebook in the teenager area of the library. Not a good combination. But I wasn't thinking. I was in my creative mode. That said, if I had not camped out in the teenager area of the library, what happened next would not have happened. And it spawned a whole series of events after that. In walks a friend of mine, a young woman whom I'd gotten to know out at the 4-H center where I was working at the time. She's a teenager, and she's looking a little bit bemusedly at me on the floor with my laptop. So we got chatting, and then she walked over to one of the shelves, pulled a book off the shelf, and said, "You need to read this." And she's holding a teenager novel. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm a middle-aged man working on a very grown-up book. I don't have the time or the interest to be reading a teenage novel. So we got into a discussion. She said, no, this is too important. The subject matter of this is too important. I'd like you to read this and tell me what you think. So we talked about it, and we entered into a pact. I said, okay, here's the deal. I'll read the teenage novel if you agree to go online and check out some articles that I've had published and tell me what you think. So that was the pact. So I don't think she held up her end of the bargain. I will say that because I never heard back. But I did check out the novel and I read it. And it kind of blew me away. The title of the novel is 13 Reasons Why by J. Asher. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I think most recently, I believe it became a Netflix TV series. And I was so touched by it. The subject matter, teenage suicide. Let me read you the premise. This is what got me. Clay Jensen returns home from school to find a strange package with his name on it lying on his porch. Inside, he discovers several cassette tapes recorded by Hannah Baker, his classmate and crush, who committed suicide 2 weeks earlier. Hannah's voice tells him that there are 13 reasons why she decided to end her life. Clay is one of them. If he listens, he'll find out why. So I wrote an article on that, as I normally would when something touches me very deeply. And it got published, and the title I gave the article was The Lonely Passion of Youth. I'm not going to read the article, but I'll reference some parts of what I said. I said, in essence, it's a love letter to a young life that couldn't take any more, and a sobering wake-up call to the reality of teenage suicide in youth culture today. And did some research, and according to the Jason Foundation, that's an online parent resource program for parents who are concerned about their kids in terms of suicide. According to this foundation, suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for college-age youth and ages 12 to 18. More teenagers and young adults die from suicide than from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, stroke, pneumonia, influenza, and chronic lung disease combined. Each day in our nation, there are an average of 3,041 attempts by young people, grades 9 to 12. If these percentages are additionally applied to grades 7 and 8, the numbers would be higher. 4 out of 5 teens who attempt suicide have given clear warning signs. Then I continued in the article, and the irony here, where the novel is concerned, is that Hannah Baker's friends learn of these warning signs in their peer communications class. But then, what's another dull class when it can be relegated to the twilight zone of information overload? Right? Wrong. Hannah Baker's tapes reveal a young life marred by vicious rumors and their unintended or unforeseen repercussions. Sleazy voyeurism, manipulative ingratiation, sexual harassment, deep emotional insecurity, and an unrecognized quest to be simply known, loved, and accepted for the sensitive soul that she is. Now, what I didn't touch on in that article in 2015 are the areas of cyberbullying, shaming, inordinate amounts of time spent in chat rooms and on social media platforms like WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, and so on. The more time spent on these platforms, and research bears testament to this, the lonelier and more socially isolated and disconnected a vulnerable teenager is likely to feel. But that also applies to adults. So the bottom line, many of our young people in their teenage years in particular are lonely, and they're disconnected, and they're scared, and they're taking their lives as a last resort. I'll leave that there for the moment. We can come back to that a little bit later. Okay, the second part of my little roadmap here, loneliness and being alone. So I wrote another article on this topic in 2015. For some reason, I got very interested in the subject of loneliness. So this other one was written before the one on the lonely passion of youth, and this one I called Navigating the Ins and Outs of Loneliness. Got a lot of readers, and where I published it online. So I begin with a quote. Language has, this is by Paul Tillich, who was a great 20th century theologian and existentialist philosopher. This is what he says. Language has created the word loneliness to express the pain of being alone, and it has created the word solitude to express the glory of being alone. And here's part of my little reflection. As I gaze upon the winter grey outside my window, the naked scene reminds me of loneliness. As billowing, wispy snowflakes flit riotously through the gnarled branches of an old maple tree, it strikes me there is a dance-like interplay to what we experience as loneliness throughout our lives. It can be existentially searing in its intensity and an endearing saju of wisdom in moments of solitude. The question is, how do we navigate the ins and outs of loneliness as they weave in and out of our lives? So let me give you a definition of loneliness. I got this from, let's see who wrote this. Is developing a psychosociological view in his essay, Research on Social Support, Loneliness and Social Isolation Towards an Integrated View of Personality. The psychologist K.S. Rook defines loneliness as an enduring condition of an emotional state that arises when a person feels estranged from, is misunderstood or rejected by, and or lacks appropriate social partners for a desired activity, particularly activities that provide a sense of social integration and opportunities for emotional intimacy. I like that. That is a good working definition of loneliness, but for me it lacks one thing: spirit. Loneliness has a spiritual dimension. And I'm going to come back to that in just a few moments. And then I kind of concluded this part of this article by saying, loneliness is one of the fundamental human emotions we will experience along the way. It is an unavoidable, existential human condition. The key is to learn and grow from the experience. Okay, so the ins of loneliness. Again, I'll just quote myself from what I reflected on in terms of the ins of loneliness. So I believe there are two sides to the ins of loneliness, the bright side and the shadow side. The bright side has to do with healthy, balanced, and necessary self-reflection. Regardless of temperament and personality, everyone needs time alone. A sacred space somewhere in your day, somewhere in your week, where you can spiritually recharge and center. It can be a form of meditation. I just recently started yoga a few months ago. Reading a book quietly in a coffee shop. Taking a day where you're detached from your devices. Walking the beach, nature, whatever. You need a day or time in the week. I think it's very important to give yourself that. To reconnect with the spiritual essence of who we are. And failure to do this, as I see it, not only depletes our energy and creativity, but it leaves us so enslaved to our digital devices and pixelated reality that we forget there is a real natural world beyond our screens and monitors. The shadow side of the ins of loneliness has to do with overindulging alone time. I'm guilty of that. I'm an introvert. I'm introspective. I'm contemplative. My life can be very busy at times. But there's the danger of overindulgence of your alone time. The problem is, I put it, alone time and solitude are not only pleasant, they generate the oxygen that keeps particularly introverts physically, morally, emotionally, and spiritually breathing. But there comes a time when the oxygen mask needs to be removed, or we can tailspin into becoming unhealthy, even sociopathic recluses. As a human species, we are intimately communal and need the lifeblood warmth, energy, companionship, and provocation of others to sustain and challenge us. Deprived of such for long periods of time, we shrivel and die. And many, many nurses and medical practitioners will tell you that where they work. Without the human touch and the human presence, the person will die much, much more quickly. Okay, that's a few little thoughts on what I call the ins of loneliness, now the outs of loneliness. Like the ins of this existential state, the outs too have their bright and shadow sides. When loneliness overwhelms, our response tends to be a healthy, integrated reaching out for connection, or an unhealthy, restless, compulsive search for someone or something to fill the void that can never be filled. Socializing, with friends or quality time spent with an intimate companion, spiritual director, or mentor can exemplify the former. Overextension of self at work, excessive bar time or shopping binges, and so on can exemplify the latter. We know we need to be with others, but in its fragmentary state, our need often morphs into or masks neediness. We can't bear to be alone. Noise, busyness, restlessness, constant stimulation, and distraction are the hallmarks of the urbanized and socially isolated world we have created for ourselves. So, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram won't cut it. We need nourishing, meaningful, and compassion-filled companionship in our lives. More importantly, we need to recognize our moments of existential loneliness and anguish for what they are, particularly for what they are in this day and age. The progeny of a disintegrated human community that has technologically stripped us of our capacity to be alone. There was a funny picture that came up on my Facebook the other day from someone, you probably have seen this one, with this group of people standing at a railway track waiting for the next train to come by. And there's like young people sitting around, older people. Every single person in the picture is staring at their smartphone, except one person somewhere in the back. And the caption, it's one of these fake news things. The caption underneath the picture is, young man, 29, seen without smartphone or something, where it's still unclear what is wrong with him. So it's fake news, funny thing, but it makes a point. Okay. So let me move into the spiritual dimension of loneliness. Okay, if I can find what I had about that. 1 second here. Okay, here we go. I'm quoting now not from myself, but from a writer I've admired over the years. He's a Canadian priest, Ronald Rolheiser. And he writes a weekly article, or at least he was for years, around the world on just various topical issues. And this one he wrote back in, 2008 or something like that. but it's one that I've always remembered, and it touched me deeply. And here's where, and again, I'm not going to read his whole article, but I'm going to reference a few points that he makes. And the title of his article simply was Gethsemane, the Place of Moral Loneliness. Our deepest loneliness is not sexual, but moral. More than we yearn for someone to sleep with sexually and emotionally, we yearn for someone to sleep with morally. What we really want is a soul mate. What does this mean? Ancient philosophers and mystics used to say that before being born, each soul is kissed by God and then goes through life always in some dark way, remembering that kiss and measuring everything in relation to its original sweetness. Inside each of us, there is a dark memory of having once been touched and caressed by hands far gentler than our own. That caress has left a permanent imprint inside us, one so tender and good that its memory becomes a prism through which we see everything else. That dark memory of first love creates a place inside us where we hold all that is precious and sacred. It is a place we most guard from others, but the place where we would most want others to enter. The place where we are the most deeply alone, and the place of intimacy. The place of innocence and the place where we are violated. The place of compassion and the place of rage. It is the place where we most want someone to enter and yet where we are most guarded. On the one hand, we yearn to be touched inside this tender space because we already know the joy of having been caressed there. On the other hand, we don't often or easily let anyone penetrate there. Why? Because what is most precious in us is also what is most vulnerable to violation. More deeply than we long for a sexual partner, we long for moral affinity. For someone to visit us in that deep part where all that is most precious is cherished and guarded. Our deepest longing is for a partner to sleep with morally. Yesterday I officiated at a wedding out in Hungry Mother Park. I do weddings a little bit on the side. That's a ministry I really, really love. But I usually will say to the couple, I kind of liken marriage to a homecoming. That when you've reached that part of the journey in your relationship where you feel it's time to solemnize and ritualize the relationship we believe we have, we choose marriage. But what I remind them is that marriage is really it's a spiritual, moral, emotional homecoming, or it should be. You're entering into a place where you know you don't belong to the person, but you belong with them. Because they are the person who love you, value you, non-judgmentally and unconditionally in the deepest parts of your soul. And they do the same for you. And I call that, and it's not my words, moral companionship. If the relationship is not founded on or evolves from a place of moral companionship, it will disintegrate sooner or later. Okay. Your checklist. Homework time. And for me as well. So here's the checklist. Like my little presentation has four points. Number 1. Recognize and acknowledge feelings of loneliness for what they are. Identify and accept them for what they are. Come home to them, befriend them, learn to understand them, reflect on them. Number 2, who can you reach out to alleviate these feelings if they are overwhelming or life-threatening? Number 3, check in on family and friends. There's a lot of people we know and love, but they're not on our radar, and vice versa. So I would always say check in on it. I mean, I go to visit someone, I do a little bit of hospice volunteer work, and there's a lady I visit out at the Abington Health and Rehab. And every time I go in, she's there on her own. And, the nurses come and go, and there's activities, but she's just not always able to attend those. There's searing loneliness in many people who are on our radar, but we're not paying attention. Check in on family and friends, be they very young or very old. And number 4, keep in mind the spiritual dimension of loneliness. Underpinning it could be a deep quest for moral companionship. Thank you for your time and attention.